Okay, Evie Wyld is the award-winning author of 2 previous novels, After the Fire, A Still Small Voice, and All the Birds Singing, which I was telling her I thrust into the hands of countless friends and even strangers. Her newest novel, The Bass Rock, dives even deeper into her investigations of trauma, both lived and inherited, also identity and self-reliance, all told through the story of 3 generations of Scottish women determining new fates for themselves. The tone of Evie's work is singular. It's gruff and warm, open and secretive all at once. But I think the thing that moves me the most about her writing is how human it is. Unlike so much literary fiction, which is dazzling but cold, you can always hear the muscle and the heartbeat in Evie's stories, even as she keeps us guessing till the very last page. We're so fortunate that she will be joined in conversation tonight by Hilary Kelly. If you've sent a friend an author interview or book review from Vulture in the past year, chances are it was written by Hilary, who covers both book and television. She also writes for a bunch of other magazines, and her latest piece on Emma Cline in the LA Times, I recommend it. It is just not to be missed. Please help me welcome Evie Wyld and Hilary Kelly to Politics and Prose Live.
Thank you. Hey, Evie.
Hi, good to see you.
You too. So, I don't know, have you ever done this? Have you done a online book event like this? I'm assuming you've done a ton.
Yeah, I've done a few Instagram ones, and they're quite strange, but I'm getting used to it, I think.
Yeah. I'm just gonna keep pretending I can hear everyone laughing at our jokes, and I think that'll make me feel a lot better. We're writers, we need a lot of affirmation. So, exactly. You know, if like a little applause could come up.
Yeah,
that would be great.
Just pay your daughter a $5.
So I think you're gonna read for a few minutes first from the book, and if you want to set up for everyone, you know, where you'll be reading from, and I don't know what section it is yet, and give them any backstory that they need.
Okay, well, because I'm incredibly lazy, I'm going to read from the beginning, and then I don't need to do all that much backstory. So as Liz mentioned, it's a story about different generations of women and the different challenges they face, from being called a witch in the 1700s to 1950s housewifery, and then a sort of present day sort of very thinly veiled version of my life. And there's ghosts and there's murders and that sort of thing, you know. It's got a lovely cover, which I'm very proud of. I think it's a beauty. I'm always pleased when they get a shark in on the cover. So this is just the beginning, and this is from Viv's section, which is the present day. I was 6, and just the 2 of us, my mother and I, took Bowie for a walk along the beach where she and Dad grew up, the shore a mix of black rock and pale cold sand. It was always cold. Even in summer we wore wool jumpers, and our noses ran and became scorched with wiping on our sleeves. But this was November, and the wind made the dog walk close to us, her ears flat, her eyes squinted. I could see the top layer of sand skittering away so that it looked like a giant bedsheet billowing. We were looking for cowrie shells among the debris of the tide line. I had 2 digging into my palm, white like the throat of a herring gull. My mother had a keener eye and held 6. I felt the pull of victory slackening. Resting in a rock pool was a black suitcase, bulging at the sides. The zip had split, and where the teeth no longer held together, I saw 2 fingers tipped with red nails and 1 grey knuckle where a 3rd finger should have been. The stump of the finger, like the miniature plaster ham I had for my doll's house. The colour had been sucked from the knuckle by seawater, leaving just a cool grey and the white of the bone. It was the bone, I suppose, that made it so much like the tiny ham. I moved my arm to swat something away from my face, and as I did, flies rose from the suitcase in a cloud, thick and heavy. Behind me, my mother. Another one, she called. I found another one. And then the smell, like a dead cat in the chimney in summer, a smell so tall and so broad that you can't see over or around it. My mother walked up behind me. I kept looking at the fingers and trying to understand. My mother pulling me by the arm. Come away, she said, and spitting over and over onto the sand. Don't look, come away. But the more I looked, the more I saw, and peeking through the gaps between the white fingers was an eye that seemed to look back at me, that seemed to know something about me, and to ask a question and give an answer. In the memory, which is a child's memory and unreliable, the eye blinks. Leave it there. Nice cheery thing to start.
Yeah. Thank you, Evie. I love that. I love that because it right after that, we switch away entirely from that moment, and we don't get a lot more information about who's in this suitcase and what has happened to this. We know it's a woman, right? We assume it's a woman. She's got these painted fingernails. This could be a man. But we don't really find out much more about her, but this really sets the tone for a lot of the other ways in which women in this book and in some of your other fiction are sort of are like shoved aside or prepackaged or, you know, sort of folded up in little bits. But the first thing I wanted to ask you about, first of all, I wanted you to clarify something, which is bass rock, bass rock, because I hate when I can't say something properly out loud, and I can't tell if it's one of those Scottish things where it has some, you know, crazy name that I can't quite say. Or...
it's bass like the fish.
Bass like the fish.
Yeah. I've always assumed that's where it's from, but
yeah,
I'm sure there's some ancient reason.
Right. Some Celtic lore, or I don't know.
Yeah.
So first, can you just talk a little bit about the real Bass Rock, which I've been to the Firth of Forth, which is where I have been to the Firth of Forth and right outside Edinburgh, or near Edinburgh. But I'd never had been to the Bass Rock or seen it. And I didn't really know much about it until I started to read this book. And then I felt myself really compelled to look it up. And if anybody's, I mean, I'm sure you're all at home and you're on your computers, if you want to actually just Google it and look at the image of it, because when you see what the Bass Rock looks like, this sort of totally vegetation-free rock in the middle of the ocean with a lighthouse protruding from it, it feels ominous just looking at it. But I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about the actual Bass Rock and what it means for you and where you sort of got this setting from.
Yeah, so the Bass Rock itself it's a volcanic plug. So it's kind of like you say, there's no palm trees on there. It's got the world's biggest colony of gannets. So it's basically covered in bird shit and it stinks. And it's got this little unmanned lighthouse. And it's, you know, it's been there for hundreds of thousands of years, and it's a hermit lived there, you know, centuries ago. It was a jail for Catholics. It's a really peculiar place, and it's got this really interesting quality that I have always been really drawn to, that at high tide it looks like it's so far out to sea that, you know, it's just a little dot on the shoreline, and then at low tide it looks like you could swim it and, you know, you could almost touch it. And I used to go to North Berwick, which is the section of coast that it's right off of, a lot when I was a child. I had a very grand great aunt who lived there in a massive house, which is sort of the house that a lot of the book's set in. And there are photographs of me there as a young kid in a swimming costume, freezing on the beach, you know, trying to look like I'm having a nice time. And then
all British swimming is cold swimming.
Yeah, it's the most like British holiday destinations, like an outdoor swimming pool as well for no reason, right on the sea. And then when my father and then my grandmother both died within a year of each other, I inherited the family photo albums and found all of these pictures of him as a toddler in a woolen swimming costume with the Bass Rock behind him in the background. And it just this sort of nice moment of that sort of telescoping through time and generations, and just, you know, looking at the people in the picture and how different they were, and the same things that are in our faces, and then the differences, and then there's the rock behind looking exactly the same. And my grandmother was a particularly kind of interesting and difficult woman, and she was sort of the sort of person who would enjoy a winter picnic. I don't know who these people are, but
hardy, but a little bit out of her mind.
Yeah, really drunk. She would be sort of drinking all day and chain smoking, but very, very grand, and would say things like, "Darling, isn't it perfectly ghastly?" She's one of those British people. There aren't many of them about, but she was one of them. And she just had this really strange life. When I knew her, she was a very unhappy, very tall, thin woman, and she was sort of waiting to die. And that's all I really knew about her, that she hadn't been the best mother to my father. And then, you know, looking back at these photographs, I found a much more visceral, interesting kind of depth to her. So yeah, that was kind of why North Berwick and the Bass Rock felt important, because they're these places that are, in my mind, kind of, they do funny things with time. It's such a 1950s spot, and thinking about people growing up there fascinates me, because for me it was always a holiday place, but the people sort of stuck there, or, you know, or deliberately there because they love it, because it's very beautiful, and it's a fascinating landscape. You've got the Bass Rock, and then you've got a mountain called the Law, not mountain, but like a kind of strange hillock, which has got a whalebone right at the top. And then in between is a load of golf course. I believe your president frequents it, which is such an
honor for the golf course.
I know, right? And it's, I mean, golf is such a strange thing there, because it's this wild landscape, and they've like wallpapered over with this green.
Right.
It just doesn't, you know, there's covered in oil and sand and spume and stuff. And
right.
Yeah, it's a lot of things pulling in different directions. That's a very long answer, sorry.
So a very particular question about this, because as I was reading the Bass Rock, I kept thinking, and no one was ever actually going there, and it was just sort of like hovering. It sort of stands over the novel. It's constantly there, and people are looking at it and thinking about it, and it's watching all the events that are happening. But I kept thinking of the Godrevy Lighthouse in To the Lighthouse, and I was curious if that was something that you had thought about at all, about this idea of you know, like a perspective thing in the future that is sort of out there and you never get there, right? Because To the Lighthouse, they plan a trip and they never take it.
Yeah, do you know, it wasn't in the front of my brain. I'm sure it was tucked back there somewhere, because you can't really have a lighthouse without that kind of appearing somewhere. But yeah, that's a really nice idea. I do love that, the sort of impotency of kind of planning and never reaching it. I think that's really
right.
It's key to so much human movement, I think, like trying to do something and failing.
Right. Or just not even trying, just thinking about it and never getting to the trying stage.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you, the Bass Rock is made of 3 narratives, which you already sort of mentioned. There's Viv, who's set in the present day, who has inherited, or is not inherited, but she's in this house. Sort of, she's supposed to be archiving what's in there, but she's also sort of been given the gift of a place to stay, because she's very unmoored. And then there's Ruth, and her story is taking place just after World War II, and she lives in that house as well. And then there is Sarah, who is it supposed to be the 1700s?
Yeah.
I don't know if I remember the exact date.
Yeah.
And Sarah's story is actually quite different from Ruth and Viv's in a lot of ways. But I was curious if you could talk about, you know, when you make a novel like this and it has 3 women whose stories are all of equal import, you know, where the story started, you know, if it started with one woman and then these other women kind of kept knocking at your door and wanting to come in, or if you always knew that it was going to be, you know, braided narrative, or how that kind of came together.
Sure. Well, the main thing is I never know what on earth I'm doing until it's finished, and it feels. It always feels like it could completely turn around and be something else, or, you know, be one narrative or whatever right up until I'm finished, and I'm never that certain until, you know, until basically my editor says, you know, walk away now. But the way that it started was I just had my son, so I had this newborn baby, and I had an hour, maybe 2 hours a day when he napped to write. And so I couldn't really linger over, you know, I didn't have the luxury of sitting there thinking, what am I writing about? Who are these voices or anything like that? I just would write the first thing that came to my head. And they were all of these different female voices for the most part. And I think I just thought at the time, rather than panicking about the fact that I have a small child and where's my life going and how am I going to get back into my career, I will just sit down and this will be the writing that I do while I'm at this stage of massive confusion and sleep deprivation. And so that's what I did, and I had loads more voices. I think the Bass Rock is built on the bones of about 3 different novels I've written that were totally different. I wrote one that was almost entirely about my father and our relationship, and, you know, I stripped him all the way out of the book and then just put him back as a sort of dead presence at the end. And then, you know, there are these little vignettes that run through the book of women, either their murders or some point in their life along the road to a potential mishap. Mishap isn't the right word. Murder is the right word. Yeah, that's the most British I've ever been. So
small murder, just
anyway. Yeah. And I had about, I think, I don't actually know how many of them there are, but they're probably about 7 or 8. And at one point I had about sort of 25 of those, and it became about picking the ones that felt like they had the most backstory and the most kind of interest, and finding a link between them. So that was how Sarah's was found, and there's like a prehistoric murder in there as well. So then Ruth, really, as I mentioned before, had kind of came out of my grandmother and that house in North Berwick. And Viv, I sort of right the way through writing, I had a voice that was very similar to my own, and I've always shied away from that. And I just sort of went for it a bit more, you know, made it a bit more colourful.
What do you think made you feel like you could do that suddenly?
I think most of the most judgmental people in my family died all at once.
Oh no.
And I say that with love.
Oh yes.
But I think there's something very sort of stripping of having a parent die and also having a baby, and I think both of those things in quite quick succession made me you know, a bit more comfortable with examining my own voice, perhaps, because I think there's you know, again, it's that real Britishness of like, you know, don't talk about the dirty things.
Right.
And I think, yeah, I think there's something in that I felt more like, well, who cares? Like,
Yeah.
I'll just,
Yeah.
no one's gonna laugh at me.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing that I feel like a lot of people don't admit. So but they know that they feel it, which is that it's kind of funny when you put any writing out there, when you put a novel out there, or you know, an essay or anything on the internet or in print, you know that when people read it, you can't be inside their brain as it happens. And so when people who you know intimately and love, but who you're a little bit afraid of, when you know they're reading your work, it can be very stifling, right? It can really make you suppress a lot of things that otherwise you might say.
Yeah, I think I try really hard when I'm writing in the first year and a half to completely put that out of my head, because I know how much a novel changes I mean, especially when I write it, because it takes forever.
Yeah, it sounds like you've written about 10 novels in the past few years.
Yeah, it's been a while. So I try to comfort myself with the fact that it will change shape so much that that will probably get taken out anyway, or they won't recognize themselves. And for the most part, that has been fine. Like anyone I felt like I had done quite a, you know, accurate portrait of didn't recognize themselves, because we're not how we come across. So I think I've gotten away with it. I mean, my British family had a lot of warning that, you know, there's a lot of stuff that feels quite close to the boat.
A lot of wild family history in there. Yeah. I love the idea of someone who you've sort of, you know, maybe slandered a little bit, reading it and not knowing it's them and being like, oh, this person's horrible.
Dreadful person.
Who is that dreadful woman? So I want to ask you specifically about Sarah, the character who, like from the very first minute that we meet her, she's been accused of being a witch, and the village that she lives in, the villagers are threatening to burn her, basically. And she's taken in by this particular family who then sort of want to help hustle her out of danger. And I was so fascinated by her because her story, it's kind of like it feels like the root of the novel in a lot of ways. The voice is very different. And I can't help but think of, you know, accusations of witchcraft as sort of one of those, not original, because clearly women were, you know, in trouble long before this, but one of those sort of early sins cast against women in particular, like for things about women that we didn't like or couldn't explain, that they come up with this all-purpose term that they can use to get rid of these women, right? And so I was just thinking about her, and I was just curious, you know, how witchcraft kind of came into this, or the threat of witchcraft, and how you saw Sarah, her story then fitting in.
I saw it really, so Sarah kind of comes back sort of unnamed as a ghost in various places, and I think the reason it started with you know, the witchcraft, sort of the pointing finger of society, was because, you know, there is really a sense that witch hunting never finished. It just changed shape slightly. You know, you look at domestic violence, or, you know, any number of sort of crimes committed against women, and you kind of see this societal movement that feels quite similar, you know, whether it's sort of talking about women's bodies in the media, or women's relationships, or the, just like you mentioned earlier on, the kind of folding up and tucking away of uncomfortable, loud women who don't fit the right shape or the right, don't smell the right way, don't shut up, basically. It just felt like that. There's a map of Australia by an Australian journalist called Sherelle Moody, and it's an interactive map with lots of red hearts all over it. And if you click on a heart, it will show you a photograph of a woman who was found murdered, and if there's any information on her life, her death, and what happened afterwards, that Sherelle puts it there. And the most astounding thing is how many of them you click on, and they are covering Australia. How many of them you click on and it just says unknown female, and that felt to me like this strange moment of, you know, the phrase when domestic violence happens and a woman is killed by her husband, the phrase is something along the lines of it was an isolated incident with no further threat to the public. And it just feels like it's really is connected, and you only have to look at these hearts to kind of see it. And for me, that feels like the same temperature as witch hunting. You know, it's not as, it's done behind closed doors for the most part, but it still feels like the same societal kind of the allowances that are made that let that happen are quite amazing.
Yeah. Talk a little bit, if you can, without revealing too much, about this idea about actually, like, you know, people one of those words that pops up all the time in book reviews and blurbs, and is haunting. Like, everything's haunting, you know, everyone's written a haunting story, and I guess that's supposed to mean like you think about it later and it haunts you or something. But I've seen in a few novels lately, and I loved that this happened in the Bass Rock, that it's like it's a real haunting, that Sarah, her ghost truly comes back and haunts people. And it's actually, I think, a very bold move in your writing to make that real, and not just, you know, especially because we love to have stories about women where you're not sure if it's real or maybe they're crazy. And it's like, you know, it's like, why are we always obsessed with whether or not women are imagining things? I love that you made the ghost real. And I wanted to know how that sort of happened. You know, how did she start stalking this house, and how did you decide that you wanted her to actually be a presence and not an idea?
I think it partly has to do with so I'm an atheist. I don't believe in an afterlife, but I do believe that people see ghosts, and it's, you know, something we just haven't figured out what's going on with the brain, basically, what a person needs. And I like the idea that Sarah would appear or not appear in the moment when she sort of shows herself to Ruth. I'm very clear that Ruth was looking at a space and knowing that she couldn't see a girl there, but knowing really strongly what the girl who wasn't there looked like. And I made us move out and sell our flat when my son was very small, because I became convinced there was a ghost in it. And I'm, you know, as I said, an atheist.
What made you think that there was a ghost in it?
Because I had more or less the experience that Ruth has in it. I would wake up and be like, I can see with my eyeballs that there's nothing there, and I know that there's no afterlife and all of this stuff, but yet I can see a figure there, and I know what they look like, and it's not a person I remember seeing before. And you know, and it's just the it's also the instinct, you know, the hairs going back up on the back of your neck, which can be attributed to millions of things. And again, I solidly believe that it's it was something to do with me being sleep deprived and in a panic because I had a child and that wasn't supposed to happen. And what was I going to do now? And also, you know, quite a lot of death going around at the same time. And but my brain was like, you need to see this at the minute. And maybe it was something that would make me move closer to family or make me, I don't know, but it was just really interesting. And I think it kind of connected for me with women's intuition, which we are always told to ignore from, you know, the age of 10. It's like, you know, hug the creepy uncle, you know, the polite thing, don't tell anyone to shove off if they're trying to bundle you into their car, all that stuff that we're taught as women to ignore, that the hair going up on the back of your neck. And for me, they're so interlinked, that and the ghosty, the witchy parts of ourselves that we tuck away and don't sort of use. So I think that's one of the reasons that women and ghosts interest me so much, is that I think it's to do with their sort of, with our animal witchy brain.
This so all of your novels are, I mean, especially All the Birds Singing, but very much so in the Bass Rock too, there's a real sense of isolation in your writing. I think I called you like the queen of isolation or something in a write-up I did of All the Birds Singing. And I'm curious how you get, you know, you live in London. So obviously for the past few months, everyone, yes, has been a little more isolated than usual. But all that aside, I'm curious, like, your writing is so connected to the land around it, you know, in All the Birds Singing, the landscape of this unnamed island that Jake is on, and is sort of always just like right up in her face and part of what she's doing. And then here in the Bass Rock, like the seashore is like the wind from the beach and all those things are sort of just constantly part of these characters' lives. And I'm wondering, you know, is there something you have to do to get yourself in that space? Do you need to write in isolation? Do you, you know, is it, are you writing an experience that you sort of want to be in, where you want to be, I mean, obviously you don't want to be, you know, about to be murdered women, but you know, do you want to be sort of off in that space, or what draws you to that?
I think I've always, I mean, I've grown up in London, but I spent a good deal of my childhood on a farm in Australia, or on the Isle of Wight, which is the unnamed island in All the Birds Singing. And they've both got very wild, rough patches. And those parts really fascinate me, and I do like being on my own. For me, isolation with coronavirus has been like the most I've been around people in my life, and it's sort of the opposite. I'm just like, will you never go to work? So yeah, I think I was a very shy child, so I think I took in a lot. And when we're in those places, I sort of took in my surroundings a lot, and I used to go off for long walks on my own, and sort of, you know, I guess sort of played around with my imagination with the landscape quite a lot. I used to imagine creepy things in the sugarcane and ghosts and stuff like that. So I think it's just I think it just comes from a nerd child mind, really. I think it's and I think you're right that there is whenever I'm in one place, there's a longing for the other place. So I'm half Australian, so when I'm in London, there is this kind of nostalgic version of Australia that, you know, all the time and space and quiet that you need. But when I'm there, I can't write about Australia. I would only write about the UK. And the same is true the other way around. So
I'm
I think
imagining you, like, when you were writing all the birds singing, just flying back and forth, be like, okay, I need to get the part that's set in Australia now, so I'm gonna fly
that's
home
tax
to England.
deductible, right?
A very expensive book to write.
Yeah, why not?
So I wanted to ask you if there were any novels that specifically influenced this one, if that's part of the way you work, or
yeah, I think every novel I've ever read, it all goes into this sort of melting pot and teaches you something new. There are books that I go back to when I'm stuck, and one of those is The Riders by Tim Winton.
Okay, I haven't read that.
It's really good, and like mystery and weirdness. So, and then right towards, what normally happens is I'll finish it and then I'll suddenly read, like, bam, 3 amazing, really short books, which are, the books that I wish I'd written. And this time that was that was Daisy Johnson's Sisters and Megan Hunter's The Harpy, which were just amazing. So, and Max Porter, I think all those writers who managed to do stuff so briefly, like conserving their word power. And so I think I really admire that.
It's funny that you mentioned the Daisy Johnson, because not that your book and her book are the same in any way, but they have some really similar preoccupations. I mean, maybe both just in the sense that they're both very Gothic based.
Yeah.
But the presence of the house itself and sort of the lore of isolation and
no, I take that as a huge compliment. No, I love her writing. I think she's really a special writer.
Sisters was very good.
So
I'm curious about and this may be our last question, I'll have to see how we're doing on time, but I'm curious about this book is like very interested in ideas about the types of abuse or cruelty that women are subjected to, and sort of how they interact with it. But it's not exploitative of women's pain. And I'm curious how how you think about that when you're writing something like The Bass Rock, where you are writing about, women being physically and emotionally hurt by men, being intimidated by men mostly. But how you craft it so that it's not just another like spill all, like, look at this bad thing that's happening to this woman, because there is such a cult of that in literature right now.
I think so in particular, I think the murders that kind of pepper the book are those were the bits that I was really concerned that I didn't kind of make. It's really difficult because you don't want to make them like this just really awful. I mean, they are really awful, but this depressing thing to read. You want there to be there's the tension of a thriller within that, which is entertainment, and there's a really uncomfortable problem there. If you look at all of the really popular murders on telly, it's always a beautiful woman normally being killed by a very handsome man, and it's like so the way that I looked at those was again going back to the unknown women. I was just like, nobody was there in this most intimate, appalling moment of your life, and so I just tried to think about being a person in the room with one of those women each time. So I suppose that was my thinking about how to locate the sort of gravity of it without making it maudlin, I suppose, because I think there's a real danger. There's a high body count in this book, but I'm also really concerned that it should be funny as well. I I don't want to read a book about just constant death. I want to have a laugh. And I also want to be a bit frightened. So, so yeah, it was about like balancing those and keeping them quite short as well. And I think, you know, the other thing that was really important was to have some hope within the book. And I think the hope is in Viv's section in the present day one, where she finds this woman called Maggie, who she becomes friends with, and then she also makes links with her sister and her mother, and you know, they talk. It's all about talking about their own stories, and that idea that when women talk about the situations they've been in, like, you know, what happened with Me Too, then there's a huge power in that, and there is some hope that things will get better, and a kind of, when women listen to their intuition, their witchiness, that like there's a power growing that will give some hope to the future.
Yeah. And Maggie's such a she's such a great character. You know, you sort of hope that someday in your life you accidentally bump into a Maggie in a grocery store the way that Viv does, and befriend her, because I even the way that they meet, right, is they're even drawn together by a bad man, in that they meet in this grocery store, and when they come outside, Maggie has seen that a man is crouched behind Viv's car. This happens in the first chapter, right? So I'm not ruining anything, but no. A man is crouched behind Viv's car, and she does that thing that we all hear about that you should do if you see a woman in trouble, where she pretends to already be friends with her. She's like, oh, I haven't seen you in so long, and the man then thinks, okay, not one woman but two. And it's this really lovely representation of sort of what happens among group dynamics in women, that you know, being one woman in the world shouldn't be scary, and it shouldn't be a reason to act a certain way, but it is. But once there are two of them, this guy's like, I'm off, right? He literally runs away. And that's what draws them together, this like strange moment of sisterhood among people who don't know one another. And I really love that. So I think our time, we should be turning to questions from the audience. So if you guys have questions, if you could type them in the little Q&A box, so that we can see them. And I can see one now where somebody asked, Tamara asked, place and voice are so important in your work. Do you always or often start with one, or do you feel you focus on both equally?
Oh, that's a nice question. I think place is probably the thing I start with. You know, I want to put someone somewhere that I'm interested in, and normally that involves a quite isolated place that could be haunted. that tends to be what I'm interested in, and places that you can't, places that change a person, that a person has to adapt to their surroundings, whether it's, you know, how they dress or how they walk or what times of the day they sleep. I've always found that interesting about writing about Australia, that the landscape changes, you know, the sun burns the skin, and there are things in the sea that will sting you and eat you, and it's so different from the place that I mostly grew up, that fascination is, you know, that the sound is kind of turned up on it. So yeah, place, I think.
Yeah. It's everything in Australia wants to like sting you or bite you, right? It's my husband is Texan, and everything in Texas, like somehow gets physically embedded in your skin while you're there.
I've never met a scorpion, but I believe those are the ones I don't want to see.
So we have a question. Jody asks, can you talk about how your novels go from a first draft to a final draft? You hinted at this a little bit. You talked about how this novel was sort of a bunch of different novels. But she says, and do you enjoy the revision process? And if you say yes, I'm going to be really upset with you, because I don't know if that enjoys the revision process.
As someone who's hurting. Do you know what? Every novel I've written very differently. So every one I've written has taught me how to write that book and nothing else. And so as soon as I finish, I feel as at sea as I did before I'd written any, which is not that encouraging, I don't think. But I would say there's probably 20% of writing a novel, which is that like filmic, lovely, you know, you're just on your own drinking whiskey and it's the words are flying out and you're creating these models and it's incredible. And the rest of it is just like, oh God, why does she have to have a family? Or how has she got from like, has she got the train or the tube? Like there's a lot of plausibility stuff, which is a real pain in the bum. Revisions, I don't know, I have such great editors that the way they work is they offer up the right questions to me. They don't say, you know, red line through this is wrong, fix it.
Rubbish.
They're like very tactfully, do we think that's the right, you know, mode for whatever to happen? And they'll just ask questions that make you think about characters differently, and that's all, you know, I really worry about with revisions. It's like, have I answered the questions correctly? So I'd say I don't hate revisions, because at that point I always welcome somebody else's eyes on it, but it is hard work, and I salute you.
It's because there's something about turning in a draft of anything and you have that moment of like, I've sent out the draft. And then, you know, however much longer later it comes back to you and you're like, I am not nearly done. It's just the beginning, isn't it?
The amazing amount of little mini celebrations you have when deep down, you know, there's another year to go.
Not until like the actual, like the dust jacket shows up that you're like, okay. So Deanna says, thank you for this astounding book, which I blew through in 2 days. Would you please speak about the recurring figure of the fox? What it embodies for you, its history as being familiar to witches, etc.
I think foxes and sharks are, I think I've got them in all 3 books. I just find them really interesting, their human interaction with both animals. It's like, you know, one generally goes a bit better than the other, but I think
foxes are awful.
I think foxes, you know, we've got so many versions of them in fairy tales where they're the kind of attractive baddie, you know, the
Robin Hood fox, right?
Like everyone had the hots for him.
Sexy animated Robin Hood fox.
But he's also, you know, really kind of disgusting place. Like we've got we have a set in the garden at the minute, and the babies they're so confident and they come up and just stare at you in the face, and they're sort of stinky. I don't know, they're so human in that way, and the way they eat and the way they, I don't know, they're so close to dogs, which we think of as these cuddly things, and they're almost beautiful cuddly creatures, but then there's this foulness which I really like. And so I think any animal that is wild but has interaction with people is so interesting.
I kept thinking, and maybe I'm totally off base here, but the thing I kept thinking about with the fox is that in England especially, I mean in America not at all, but in England foxes are really a class indicator, in the sense of like fox hunting and they always have that connotation in my mind of being, you know, sort of belonging to a particular, like a wild creature that sort of particularly belonged to one set of people, until very recently, right, when fox hunting was
just in your bins.
outlawed.
I mean, and fox hunting still goes on, and it's still, all of the pomp and ceremony is very peculiar, that is all based around that little animal.
Right. It's very performative. It's like it's not just the hunting, it's the
No,
hunt.
the
And,
sherry and the funny outfits and the just portliness generally.
right. So someone who's anonymous asked, what are your favorite books about isolation or your favorite solitary characters? And I'm so interested to know the answer to this.
Oh my God. Well, I feel like most protagonists are solitary, aren't they? I mean, I think because you're only ever in your own head. And so the internal world is so solitary, and finding out what a character is actually thinking about. So, I mean, again, going back to Tim Winton, he was who I started reading when I was a kid and made me want to write, because I was so interested in that internal world of an author, and I had the misconception that an author had the stories that went on beyond the characters' lives on the page in their head. Mm-hmm. And I just thought, what an amazing thing to have. So I don't know if I don't tend to read books and think that way about them. And my brain is very weak at this time of night. So I don't have any at the tip of my fingers, but Megan Hunter's The Harpy that I've just reread because I did an event with her was, again, that's a lonely character, slowly changing into a harpy, and that is astounding. Yes. Some of us more than others. I think I could find isolation in most characters, especially the loud ones. I think.
A book that I do think I read it at around the same time as I read All the Birds Singing, and it they spoke to me in similar ways about physical isolation. Mm-hmm. Was I'm definitely not saying the name right, but Gibran Bakker's 10 White Geese.
Oh.
Bakker is, I want to say, Dutch.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a novel about a woman who is supposed to be writing a book about Emily Dickinson, and she is off by herself in a cabin, sort of being, oh God, I'm going to use the word haunted by things that are like external factors, and trying to sort of figure out what's going on directly outside her house in a way that's kind of similar to what's going on.
Nice.
Jake. That's my, like, I always think of them in tandem when I think about it.
Really? I will look that up. I just thought of another one, which was The Idea of Perfection by Kate Grenville.
Okay. I read that.
And it's actually about two isolated people meeting, but the book's very much in, part of it's in his head and part of it's in hers, and they've been alone for a long time. And so I think that I think a lot of my female characters come from that book, which I read quite a long time ago. Yeah.
So Jody asks, what do you like to read when you're writing? Work similar to what you're writing or different?
Sort of, I don't know, it's difficult because a lot of the time I'm reading proofs that get sent to me.
Oh, I thought you said Proust, and I was like,
oh yeah, of course.
You're often reading Proust. Casually reading Proust all the time.
Yeah. So I read a lot of debut stuff, not because I don't think I think enough about what I read, basically. I just am like, I need to read something now. This one's been recommended by someone I like, and that is why I'll start reading it. And I have a huge reading pile, and I never get to the bottom of it, and it's a huge guilty horror of mine. I'm a really slow reader as well, so a novel will take me 3 weeks. I'm always amazed when people say that they read my book in 2 days, because I'm like, I can't read my book in 2 days. I've got to reread it in a minute, and I'm like, oh, it's a really long one.
All these pages. Why did I keep writing?
So I think the answer is it's complete havoc. It's debut writers. It's writers I know that I'll never be able to be like. It's writers who sometimes I'm like, oh God, we're a bit similar, and that's fine.
Does that scare you a little bit when you read someone and they're sort of similar?
No, because I think it's a bit like that thing. If I think I've nailed someone by writing a description of them and they never see it, the way I think I write is very different from the way that I actually write.
Do you read your reviews?
No. I tell you what I do. I skim down to the penultimate paragraph where it says, however, ultimately. And then I'm like, it's good or bad. And that's all I want to know. Like,
no, you know what? There is nothing actually that drives me more nuts than a review that seems like very like positive and affirming. And then in that penultimate paragraph, they have like 12 issues with the novel, which they just want to cram in. It's like, did it bother you that much? If it bothered you that much, it seems like you would have
worry about it.
gotten into it. Or do you just feel like you have to say something critical, or you look like a flat, like?
It's funny. It's really funny, and I think there's part of me that there's no point in reading them because you don't believe the good ones, and the bad ones you obsess over. So I don't know, the bad ones you're like, yeah, no, you're totally right. Scribble, scribble, scribble. So
I think you should
out what you do. Well, then maybe there's a danger of not writing more if you're just like,
I've done it.
I'm pretty great. So
I'm good. So we have a question. How do you protect your own sense of peace and safety when tackling tough subjects, which is especially in a book like this?
Yeah, I think I just don't. I don't think there's I think it's clear it's a book that brings up a lot of personal stuff. And I think like early on I was very sort of nervy about like, who would read it and who would know certain things about my life. And then I just thought, it's about that excavation. It's about kind of shining a light on things. So, I'm all right. A lot of people aren't. So I feel like for me personally, writing about the hard things, very fictionalized, that were part of my life, I think I'm okay with that. I don't see it as therapy or anything like that, but I just feel that they are valid moments that I got some enjoyment, honestly, in writing about them, because it felt like owning something. And I'm being very cloak and dagger about what those bits are, but I think the thing that is most interesting to me about writing is, and this happened with the last book, with All the Birds Singing, that I did a radio interview in which I said something I really didn't mean to say, because it was like the part of the book that I had really tucked away and thought, whatever happens, don't say this. And I was being interviewed by Mariella Frostrup, who is an amazing interviewer, and she saw me tucking something away, and she prodded at me until I talked about it, and it ended up being this lovely thing that lots of people got in contact with me about, and were like, that's the feeling that I have too when I'm so relieved that you've spoken about it. And I think that's very like the act of reading, when you read something and you connect with an image or something that feels like you felt like you were the only one who saw it that way. I don't know, it all feels bound up together, and I think in order to do that I had to go, the band-aids are off a bit.
So Fiona says, I read The Bass Rock at the same time I was watching I'll Be Gone in the Dark, the amazing documentary about the Golden State Killer, and the themes were amazingly parallel, particularly the healing power of women banding together and sharing their ordeals, as you were saying, both immensely powerful works. no real question, except any hint. and then she asks about what you're working on now. But that was an amazing lead up to be like, well, tell us about your next book.
Oh, well, that's really lovely. I mean, I haven't read or watched I'll Be Gone in the Dark, but I'm so keen to. It's just that because of lockdown, I have to watch it with my husband, and he wants to watch it too, but he'd also like to watch just some mindless comedy. So every night I'm like, and I'm a huge My Favorite Murder fan, and I think they do so much great work with getting women talking. But so what I'm working on now, it's a really funny. I finished working on the Bass Rock over a year ago, and normally at this point I'm like busily kind of into the next thing, or I'll be thinking about the next thing while I'm finishing up the last thing. But with this book, I'm still quite in the headspace of it. And also with lockdown, I mean, I've had 2 days since March. So there's not a whole lot going on.
You also own a bookstore.
Yeah, I don't run it anymore, which is you know, a relief. but I do part own it. And so there are a lot of moving parts to life at the minute, and I am being overly gentle with myself in terms of work, which will come and bite me on the bum quite soon, I'm sure. But really, I'm still kind of thinking about the people in that book now.
Yeah, I feel like it would be a hard one to shake. I mean, especially with the tie-in with your own family. And
I think because it was it felt like the other two books were sort of, they're their own objects, but it also felt like they were leading up to this book in a way. It kind of says more succinctly what I wanted to say in those two.
Right. So we have another question here. It says, at the start you mentioned your love for the US dust jacket. You guys don't have the book.
Beauty.
Do you have a UK copy there? Because the question says the UK version is very striking as well.
Just grab it.
What are you?
My mum's house, so she's got them up here.
Oh, she better have your book. It says, what are your thoughts on how the UK version illustrates and relates to the story? They are incredibly, I mean, I have to say, if I saw them next to one another, I would not get the sense that they were about the same thing.
No, exactly. I think, you know, without wanting to upset anyone at home, I had to be convinced quite hard on the plums. I think it's really striking, and I think it's really beautiful. But I do love Joan Wong's work, and she did my, I've got my other book up there.
Because the Bass Rock one reminds me of all the birds singing cover quite, I mean,
well, it's the same designer, and she just, I don't know, it just works, and it feels like it moves through different times, and it's really intriguing. And I think this is really stylish and fun, and you know, and I think if you saw it in a bookshop, you'd be like, oh, that's, you know. And as soon as you open it, you do see Viv in the grocery, right? And she's buying what, like 30 plums, and she lives by herself, and she's like, well, I clearly need, 30 plums. And it's sort of like she says something like, this was the kind of task I knew I could accomplish, right? Like, it's one of the only things she can finish, eating a full package of plums, which actually feels very, I mean, I totally get that. You're like, attainable, right?
Like, they tell you to like write a list of things you've already done and cross them off along the way. Very like, I can do this. So if anybody has any more questions, I think we're about to wrap up. So we'll wait one more minute for any more questions. Other people just said thank you, and please keep writing amazing books, which is so lovely.
Evie, will you hold up the book one more time?
Yeah,
I'll do it too, because you need to.
Oh yeah, I only have the eGalley. God. Everyone, please buy it. It's super wonderful. Thank you both so much. We got into such a remarkably rigorous conversation about other titles, and we will send out an email to support all those other authors too. So thank you both. Thank you, Hilary. Everyone, please stay well and stay well read, and read Evie's book.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys. It was fun.